Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Family Treehouse, a podcast series brought to you by Storied, where I chat with people that have a passion for genealogy, storytelling, or both. I'm your host, Heather Haunert, and I am super excited today to have our guest, Sadie Nelson from Tales and Trees with us. Welcome, Sadie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Super excited that you're here and chatting with us today. So let's just start with having you tell us about your background. How did you get started in the field of family history and or storytelling?
I think every genealogist has a good story about how they got started. Mine was I grew up less than a mile away from my grandma, my maternal grandmother's house. I was lucky enough where I was babysat by her when my parents were at work for quite some time. And I would spend hours at her kitchen table looking through her photo albums, old scrapbooks from when she was a child. And I remember seeing photos of her mother, old cabinet cards from Austria-Hungary. And I was always very interested in those pictures. I had so many questions for my grandma. And she passed away in 2014. And even though she had 9 children, all of whom are living, I was lucky enough to inherit all of those albums.
Oh, that's
Um,
awesome.
yes, yep. And her children, I asked them and they were happy to let me have them. And I've kind of acted as a family genealogist since then.
I think every family has that person, don't they? And
Mhm.
I just always feel like such honor that it gets to be me. So that's fantastic.
Yes, me too. Yeah.
And lucky that you had your grandmother for that long and to be able to ask her and have the wherewithal to ask those types of questions is awesome. Not everybody's that forward thinking.
Hmm.
So I'm gonna ask some more genealogy based questions. I love, for our listeners out there, I love Sadie's Instagram. It's amazing. And she has some very cool tips and tricks and just general genealogy things on there. So the first thing is that caught my attention a while back was Google Lens. So tell
Hmm.
us, how do you use Google Lens with genealogy?
I started using Google Lens for not really a genealogy hobby, but antiquing, which is kind of related to genealogy, I think.
Great idea.
Um, yep, I love to go to estate sales, things like that. I definitely, my favorite thing to look for is things that have a name on them, something like an heirloom that's for sale, things like that. So I started using it for objects to look at how to. Sometimes it's too hard to Google an object if you have a necklace that looks a certain way. It's hard to find words to type that into Google, and Google Lens is fabulous for that. And then the more I got into collecting photographs, cabinet cards of not even my own family, but just from other individuals, I thought, a lot of these have landmarks. Because a lot of early photography was taken outside, outdoors,
Mhm.
and nothing written on the back. So how can I find out where this was taken to try to maybe place it to an individual if there is a name but no location? And I just started kind of messing around with Google Lens. And it is surprisingly helpful to find not only like landmarks, so where pictures were taken, but even sometimes photography studios, the backgrounds that are used in old cabinet cards.
Good
If
idea.
yeah, that's a great way to match up those images too, if there are corresponding images online somewhere. And it's been a really useful tool so far, kind of fun to play around with.
Yeah, I immediately thought the example that you had on Insta was kind of looked like a resort hotel.
In New
Old,
Jersey, yes.
yeah, and I that immediately made me think I have a photo that is from my great grandfather, and I it has kind of like it's like a resort that rich people went to in the summer, and I have
Hmm.
never been able to figure out what it was. So I can't wait to dig that photo out and try get a lens with that and
Yes,
see
yep,
how it
give
works.
it a try. It's worthwhile, and I think it could solve a few mysteries out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the estate sale. So I'm gonna have to try that as well. That's a great tip to use that, or when I'm antiquing, to look something up. Great tips. Love that.
Yes. Hmm.
Another thing that Sadie has on her Instagram that it spoke to me personally. I told her we could be twins in this. She has an unintentional hobby of collecting cabinet cards, and you specifically do it from your ancestors' village. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm familiar with my ancestors' village. It's in present-day Czech Republic. But back in the day it was called Marish Trubau, and it was part of Austria-Hungary.
Okay.
Um, from my grandma, like I spoke about, I have a few cabinet cards, and cabinet cards are great because they have the town they were taken written on the bottom normally. And my favorite thing to do sometimes when I'm kind of bored or in between projects is to look on eBay primarily, but also just Google, but especially German eBay for, I just type in that word and portrait or photo in German sometimes, and you'll find a handful for sale, especially if it's a bigger city. But since it's such a small town that my ancestors came from, I kind of feel like I need to adopt all these images that are for sale. So I've bought quite a few. There are still more that I would love to adopt soon. I wait for discounts. Um, but I just feel like these could be relatives. It was such a small town. Even if they're not, I feel like it was a small community. They're for sale. They need a home. And I've studied that town so much that I just want more of those images. So
Yeah. I love that, and I think that people that do what we do, you do have that kind of, you want to adopt those people, and I'm like you, I'm on eBay or other sites looking for things. I've done family Bibles before, and I'm like, oh, somebody needs to just be the steward of that item if no one else is going to do it. So
Mhm.
I love that. Another part on your site that I just absolutely loved was your ancestral eats. Now I'm curious, so you make these recipes, are they family recipes or recipes of like the area?
It's a bit of a combination of both. I only have, I think, two recipes from my grandmother's side. That's what I'm most interested in. And one of them is for liver dumplings. My family will never eat those. So I try to find some recipes that are cultural and relevant to the area that they lived in, and from both my mother and my father's side. And it's a great way. I have two small children. It's a great way to incorporate genealogy a little early on with the kiddos. They don't always, they're young. They don't get the whole family tree and its significance. But if we're baking something that, my mommy's great grandma used to bake, it's just a fun way to get them interested in family history a little bit.
Makes it more real for them. Yeah.
Yep. And then they get to eat it, and we're all happy.
All right, so let's jump to some storytelling questions. Why do you think that storytelling is such an important part of family history?
I think storytelling has been around as long as people have. So right now we have we really are lucky we can Google our ancestry. There are several websites that are awesome to look at documents. But before then, before we could write, we were telling stories. Um, and some of the most important things I've learned about my family have been from stories passed down. Um, they fill in the gaps between, we might have just a 1910 census and then the 1920, and that's all we have for a relative. But those stories can help fill in the decade in between. And even though stories may get kind of, they change a little bit over the decades. Some facts get a little muddled. Um, I have I have always had great luck in finding the truth in those stories.
Mhm.
And even though things get changed a bit, they are a great way to start your research. If you know that your grandmother was born maybe in Russia, that was a story that was passed down, you can kind of use that as a filter to find some records. And it's so
Yeah.
important to keep those stories and to listen to people who have the stories too.
Yeah. How do you go about writing a story? So you kind of mentioned that, just kind of, using, if you've got just two census records, are there any other things that you use, or documents or tools, um, to help you kind of put that story together?
Yeah, I think you could say it would be easiest maybe to write a story chronologically about an ancestor. They were born here, they married, they died here. That's not always easy with genealogy because sometimes the records just aren't there. We don't know the story of their entire life. So I find it important and helpful to maybe frame a story about an important piece of that person's life. Maybe your grandmother had to immigrate because their family was very poor,
Mhm.
and learning more about not just your ancestor, but maybe the circumstances where they lived. I love to research the town in particular, find out all I can about the town to kind of fill in those gaps
Yeah.
when you're missing pieces about the actual person. Um, and it just helps to paint a more complete picture, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm a big proponent of just that historical and social context of the time, just to put you in the same shoes,
Mhm,
as your ancestor.
exactly.
What do you think about, um, this can be a hot button topic, I feel like, so I'm curious your take on this. So how do you balance, and how important do you think it is, that the need to kind of tell a factual story, but add parts in that might not be, that you don't know are exactly true? Does that make sense? So
Yes,
how
yep.
do you balance that?
Mhm. Um, that's a very good question, and I'm sure you will hear some different answers. So I work as a professional genealogist right now, but I am also pursuing certification.
Yeah.
So accuracy is of utmost importance. We are taught and we learn to never really assume things. You need facts and data, citations. It's so fact and evidence based. But I don't think that means the stories we can share about our ancestors need to be dull, boring.
Yeah.
I'm a little biased, I think, because the tiniest little details that I find out about an ancestor um, are so fascinating to me. Even if it's they were a farmer their entire lives, they lived in poverty their entire lives, it still just brings this person to life for me.
Yeah.
Um, and I think a lot of us who are interested in our heritage would agree with that. Some people like to find out if there's royalty or celebrities, and that's
Right.
kind of all they're interested in. But the majority of us just want to bring this person to life in a sense because we never knew them. They were born generations before us.
Yeah.
So I don't think we necessarily, I at least, don't need to kind of um, give up accuracy and details for an interesting story. I think that the stories are interesting regardless of what they are.
Yeah. I agree. Do you have, this is one of my questions for you, I'm just asking ad lib here. Do you have a favorite, like, is there one ancestor that you research and think about, and just like feel a connection to them, and just like want to learn everything you can about that one in particular person?
Yes, that would be my grandmother's mother. She is really the reason I got so invested into genealogy and now work as a genealogist. The story passed on was that she did not know who her father was, and that she was raised by her grandparents. And
Wow.
that's about all I had to go off of. Even my grandmother didn't know much about her own mother. She passed away when my grandmother was about 17.
Mhm.
And my grandma would write little notes in her papers. I even have notes from my grandma written on napkins, just little tidbits that she would remember and I later was able to place into the family tree. And I think we know that as women, there aren't many records on women as there are for men, of course. And I'm just so curious about my grandmother, and so much so that I traveled to the hometown in the Czech Republic a couple years
Oh,
ago.
I
That's
love
a
that. That's
Yeah, that could
awesome.
be a, a whole interview in itself. But so everything I can find out about her is just fascinating to me. Um, and she kind of continues to fuel my research today. I'm very interested in women's stories, especially.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Do you have, I would love for you to share, is there a particular family story or favorite story of yours that, just whenever you think of a family story, this is the one that comes to mind?
Oh, that is a good one in particular I can think of. It may seem small, but I think it really helps bring an ancestor to life. Those stories passed down, they can tell you more about ancestors you never will find records on.
Yeah.
So my grandmother, I was told my great grandmother was raised by her two grandparents.
Mhm.
And I know very little about them. I've only been able to find, a baptism, a marriage, a death. But a family story has been passed down um, for decades. That grandfather had a long white beard and very kind eyes. He was born in 1829, and there are no photographs of him. I don't think he ever had a photograph taken, but that image of him has been passed
Yeah,
down. And I think that's just incredible because otherwise, if that story wasn't passed down, I would have no framework of thinking of him.
yeah.
And that just kind of puts it into perspective a little more.
Yeah, agreed. It's funny. And when you hear stories like that, my mother-in-law has a story of like her great grandfather, and that it was not a long white beard, but it was grandpa with the mustache, is what she always called him. So
Hmm.
it does those visuals that people hold on to is, great for us because that's all we have to go on. So
Exactly.
it's
Yep.
great. What what are a few tips or tricks or pieces of advice or wisdom that you would leave with our audience when it comes to, and it can be anything, Sadie, genealogy or storytelling with your ancestors? What are some tips that you kind of are tried and true that you live by?
Whenever I speak to other family historians, whether they are just getting started or they've done this for decades, I always recommend sitting down through your family notes, your photographs. If you don't have them, ask the person there always seems to be some person who kind of collects them, maybe your grandma, maybe your aunt. Ask if you
Yeah.
can go and look through them. And I always recommend to page through, make notes of any names, even if you're not sure where they appear in the family tree, because they can be referenced later. For example, my grandma, in these piles of notes I collected, she knew she had two Uncle Franks.
Mhm.
That's all. She had some stories about one of them. She mixed up some stories later, but I was able to kind of use those later when I was researching and knew one was Frank Hickle, one was Frank Herman.
Mhm.
And it was so helpful to have those little bits and stories. So I always recommend going through photographs, letters, images, taking notes, looking on the back. And I think the other top thing I would say is even though we rely a lot on vital records, baptisms, death certificates, census records, they're wonderful. They should be utilized, but to fill in those stories and to really paint a picture of a person's life, um, things like newspapers can be just incredible. So I think newspapers, because they really do tell a story, newspaper articles, especially a few decades ago, really
Yes.
told a story. They would even say, so and so went to their friend's house for lunch this day, like little
Yes.
tiny bits of information, kind of like olden times Facebook almost. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so I think newspapers should be looked into a lot more than they are probably.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I think especially those small town newspapers, I do get, kind of sucked into the, Boston and New York newspapers, and they have great
Hmm.
things, but some of those small towns, I'm from a small town, and you're right. It's, Grandpa Jim went to Sally's house for lunch and
Yes.
played with
And
the kids. So
yeah, it's unfortunate because those small town newspapers aren't often digitized. You
yeah,
can't go on newspapers.com, but if you can go to a history center and flip through those microfilms,
yeah.
it takes a long time, but it's so worth it.
Yeah, it is. I agree totally. They're one of my favorites. Well, Sadie, thank you so much for your expertise and your passion in this field. And I am very honored that you've spent time with me this afternoon. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy.
Great. Well, until next time, friends, embrace the power of the family's untold stories and embark on a journey of discovery. Let the ink flow and the words dance as you weave together the threads of your ancestors' lives. Start writing your family stories today and let their voices echo through the generations to come at story.com. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Family Treehouse, where we celebrate the power of storytelling and preserving our family legacies. Storied is more than just a platform for sharing stories. Dive into those historical records and newspapers, discovering the hidden gems that bring your ancestors to life. Add branches to your family tree, connecting the dots between generations. Thank you for joining us on this storytelling journey. Your stories matter, and through story, they have the power to resonate across time and touch the hearts of generations to come. Keep uncovering your family's history and keep the spirit of storytelling alive with Storied.